We are right on time, so I'm just going to go ahead and give a brief introduction to Judy, who is the panel moderator, and then Judy will begin. So this panel is called The Deeper Meaning of Cloth. It's a discussion on art and activism. And Judy Newland, our moderator, is a retired anthropology professor and textile historian. But that's just a part of the story. There are three words Judy picks to describe herself best: maker, mother, mender. She has always been a maker since she learned to sew at 9, maybe before. As the mother of 3 sons, it has completely shaped who she is. And being a mender comes from growing up on a farm where everything was reused, recycled, repaired, and mended. Traveling much of the world has influenced the idea of mending between people and countries. Indeed, unraveling borders and weaving networks is her inspiration. Thank you, Judy. I'll let you take it away.
Okay, welcome everyone. It's so great to be here with this group of people. I have a few opening remarks, and then I'm going to introduce all of the speakers in order before we start, and then we'll let them take it away. So it's really great to have so many people here today and to discuss with us and explore the deeper meaning of cloth. Our meeting theme, Unraveling Borders and Weaving Networks, is truly an inspiration to me, both traveling much of the world and creating more than 100 exhibitions in my career has really nurtured this idea in me that I hold so dear, that textiles, art, monuments, cultures, people are not defined by one story or narrative, but each holds a broad array of meaning and values. So speaking as an anthropologist, a textile historian, and a maker, the wonderful thing about textiles is that through textiles and cloth, we can explore art, culture, society, politics, religion, math, science, and so much more, making connections between cultures and through time and place. Textiles are part of our social fabric, bringing meaning to our physical, emotional, and spiritual lives. I've used textiles to share world cultures through museum exhibitions, and when I dye fabric in an indigo blue dye pot, I look in that dye pot and I see world history, science, fashion, medicine, ritual, and your latest pair of blue jeans. It's an entire world to explore and share. Textiles can tell our stories, past, present, and future, and today, 3 amazing textile artists will share their stories with all of us. So our speakers today in order are Wendy Weiss, Adrienne Sloan, and Maggie Leininger. So I'm going to introduce them all the way through, and then Wendy will take it away. So I want to just say, these are women that I know. I've known them for a long time. Wendy shared some fun facts with us when we were Zooming. The fact that she learned to weave from Deb Chandler, how wonderful. She made her first trip to India in the early 1990s with a warp group. And Wendy is the one who first told me about warp, the meeting in 2005, which she didn't get to go, but I got to go. I was in grad school at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she teaches. And that was my first warp meeting on St. Helena Island, South Carolina. I enjoyed many of Wendy's exhibits and activities while at UNL. Wendy Weiss weaves warp ikat panels and 3-dimensional spaces in which viewers interact. She collaborates with Jay Kramer to create interactive sound environments, sculpture, and projected images. Natural dyes sourced directly from her garden are her primary dyes for her cotton, wool, and silk weavings. She was awarded 2 Fulbright Nehru Senior Scholar Awards to document ikat textiles from an artist's perspective in India, and is a past recipient of 2 Nebraska Arts Council's Artist Fellowships and a Winthrop Residential Fellowship. She exhibits in solo and group shows in North America, Europe, and Asia. We look forward to what she has to say. Adrienne, I met Adrienne at that very first meeting that I attended on St. Helena Island in South Carolina, and we have shared many meetings since then. including some lovely international trips to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Oaxaca. We live on different coasts, but we are connected through our many warp threads. Adrienne Sloan's sculptural fiber work addresses timely but universal issues while remaining mindful of the rich historical context of this medium. Sloan has exhibited and taught internationally and has worked for NGOs with indigenous knitters in Bolivia and Peru. Adrienne's work has won awards and has been published widely. She has worked in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Fuller Craft Museum, the Goldstein Museum of Design, the CAM Collection, and the American Textile History Museum, as well as in private collections. And Maggie Leininger. Maggie and I overlapped for about 5 years at Arizona State University. We worked on projects together, such as sitting in the desert on the side of the road, waiting for people to stop by and see what Maggie was weaving. And it was kind of hot. Later, after we both left ASU, I got to spend a week helping her install the Honor Quilt exhibition at the University of Louisville, which was quite the experience. We are family friends, as they adopted me into their family while we were at Arizona State University. So Maggie Leininger currently is the director and curator of the Peeler Art Center at DePauw University. In addition to her curatorial duties, Maggie is launching a communal art space in Greencastle, Indiana, that will foster community engagement through creative processes, including textile-based practice. Previously, Maggie oversaw programming at the University of Louisville related to the International Honor Quilt, which was a community-engaged companion work to Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. Previous academic service includes teaching at Arizona State University and Roosevelt University. Specializing in community engagement using textile-based techniques, Maggie has been awarded numerous grants, fellowships, and artist residencies. And so, we will let Wendy begin.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's been a really exciting morning. And I will see if I can do this. So I'm good to go. I'm really thrilled to be invited on this panel, The Deeper Meaning of Cloth. And it's really taken me down on a trip on memory lane. And so you're going to go back in time with me as I tell you about my journey interweaving politics, textiles, and projects in the community over these decades. I no longer teach at the University of Nebraska. I did start in 1986 and I took early retirement. I was very lucky to do that in 2014. But I would say I started my work really engaging with political ideas prior to the set of weavings, but this really inspired me. I was talking to my colleague in the fall of, I think it was 1986. I had just gotten to Nebraska, and he said his wife needed a ride up to a missile vigil in South Dakota. And I said, great, I'll take her. The canoe trip I was gonna take with Outdoor Rec was canceled because it was too cold. So unknowingly, I really did embark on a trip that would change my life, because we drove up to the town of Kadoka, South Dakota. And during that long drive, Mary, my passenger, informed me about the work of Nuke Watch. And I learned about the nuclear missiles, which back in the 80s, you might remember, were on alert. They weren't just passively there in the ground, but they were, many of them, buried in the hillsides around the Midwest where I lived. And so I did a series of weavings that were about the first use of nuclear missiles, and researched the bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And at the time I was working with synthetic dyes, fiber reactive dyes for the most part, on mixed fibers. And I used the fence image as a tribute to all the people who were going up to the fence and sometimes cutting it with wire cutters to express their dismay at our engagement in this arms race that was going on. It was still the Cold War. And I made drawings of people who actually had been devastated by the nuclear blasts in Japan. And then I started thinking about other political trials that people experienced around the world and used imagery that I would get from the newspaper and make screen prints and print them on my warp before I wove them. So this is before I really got serious with ECOT. I was painting and dyeing my warp yarns directly on the loom before I wove them. And then I had a personal tragedy in my family. My brother had AIDS, and when he died, it was really, weaving was a way to process what happened to him. And so I think you could use the adage that the personal is political. In 1992, we were still very early on in the AIDS epidemic, and men particularly, but of course that's changed, we're dying. So what happens to those people we love when they die? And this is influenced by, gosh, now I'll embarrass myself. I think it was Gustav Klimt, but it might have been another Austrian artist who had a wall mural of a tree of life. So it's inspired by a tree of life and the light radiating behind it. Then continuing on the left, this sculpture I did, well, I must have gotten tenure because I was no longer having to make weavings to enter into shows, and I could do what I really was interested in, which was three-dimensional work. And so I used a lot of the imagery from the nuclear missile site to make this piece called Pentagon Project. And then Wheel of Fortune's on the right. I'll show you a larger image of Pentagon Project. A friend of mine who was teaching CAD back in the 80s and 90s helped me draw the imagery, and we printed them. And other pictures are just taken from the documentation of nuclear missile test blasts. And then on the inside were images, the same images I was printing on the weavings. So I wanted to create this space where you could really confront the imagery and think about it, that an individual could enter this space. And then Wheel of Fortune, Women in the War Zone, I was thinking about the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was raging, and women were victims of war crimes. In the background, these weavings use a pixelated structure to reference what we see, what we learn so much on the news. And it's just a two-dimensional image, but these are three-dimensional people who, just by the luck of where they're born, they have to endure these terrible crises that are global political. And in addition to doing the artwork that I would pretty much do by myself, I would create projects where I interacted with the community. So for example, here in the Midwest, where we're pretty isolated, I decided to start a project called the Cultural Survival Project, and it was a collaborative, creative project with recent refugee children and a photographer who taught on campus. And we gave the kids cameras and they went home and took pictures, and we developed a set of imagery. They developed the imagery documenting their home life back in the 90s, and we put them together, and it traveled around the state of Nebraska. And sometime, I can't remember when, I became a WARP member, and it was actually the newsletter that I saw a little classified ad from Dara at Auroville, India, and he was looking for a weaver to come do some training with his weavers in the workshop. And I thought, well, gosh, it seems crazy for an American to go to India to teach weaving, but what the heck? And so India became a big part of my life back then. The Matt Talbot Kitchen is a public kitchen for serving meals to people in need. And my students designed a mural after interviewing and meeting with the people who used the facility. And we created that in the fall of 2000. Another project I did was work with Native American youth. We have an Indian center in Lincoln, Nebraska. And one of the staff members and I invited an elder to come and meet with the kids and talk to them about regalia. And so they were able to design outfits, dance outfits, which they wouldn't have been able to do in their family structure because uh, the tradition wasn't being passed down. And so Madonna Thunderhawk came and worked with us to develop a curriculum so that the kids could make their own outfits. So my work is not directly engaging with the public, except for more recently, I discovered that when I retired in 2014 and they stopped teaching weaving, some of those looms went to our maker space. And when I was visiting one day, I saw a group of veterans who were making ballpoint pens, which are quite beautiful, but I wondered if maybe they'd want to learn how to weave. And so we started a weaving group, and it was really fun. Of course, we had to pause during the pandemic, but recently the gal on the right has come back, and this is her project she's working on now, setting up. This must be her third or fourth weaving. And Michael just really enjoyed weaving, and the clear pride in his work is so great to see. And then most recently, I decided that I wanted to move into ECOT in probably early 2000 because I had put an electronic component on my loom and I couldn't paint on it anymore. And so I decided that it was time to apply for a Fulbright, and kind of naively thought, well, I'll go to India and find someone to teach me. And since Patola or double ECOT is done in Gujarat, I'll ask to go to Gujarat. Well, I got very lucky and met the gentleman on the right who did allow me to work with him and document how he put together the ECOT. He was not in Patan, which is the major double ECOT center, but in a little village called Somasar in Surendranagar, Gujarat. And I spent dedicated time with him, and he allowed me to document it. And when I came back to the United States, I thought, well, the best way I can test myself whether I can do this is to use text. And so I didn't really have specific text I was interested in. I came up with blood on my hands. And then I thought, well, gosh, that's so trite. This was going on when there was the oil prices were being manipulated, but even more than that, there was, the oil was in the news. And so I took all the letters from Blood on My Hands and used them to create this little text: shady loans, doom, oddly bland, hoods, blood on my hands, because I thought that spoke to what I was reading about in the news at that time. And then I was able to go to Poland to teach a workshop right after I left the university, and decided I would teach ECOT and natural dye, and was housed at the housing unit from the school, which was in the ghetto. Now, this wasn't my first time in Poland, but when I had been there the first time, it was close to the opening of Poland. There was no indication of World War II. But now in 2014, there were a lot of monuments that had been created about the war. And so we were in a neighborhood that was the actual ghetto. And Lichtenstadt was a German general whose name they used to identify the ghetto. This weaving followed that. Resist, thinking about how small acts defined resistance during World War II. It just so happened in 2016, it was the year I made it. So I'm not sure where my time is. Judy, how am I doing?
You were at 12 minutes, so need to wrap it up.
Okay, so I am wrapping it up here. And on my website, you can find the text, why I chose these words. And this is a recent weaving. And I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy. We'll go on to Adrian.
Okay.
I'm assuming you can see this?
Yes, there you go.
Terrific. Well, thank you to Warp for inviting us to share these stories. This is the other side of my fiber life that I'm not sure if many of you out there who are old friends even knew about, but I actually did anthropology as an undergrad, and then I traveled for 3 years in Asia after I graduated college. And I always had an appreciation for textiles. Arts were already in my family. My mother taught me to knit when I was a little kid, and I somehow discovered knitting machines in the mid-'80s and decided that after having seen some really sculptural work, decided that that would be a really fun thing to pursue. And I did that for really a long time. Many of you will remember this, the exploits of this young man who there were stories from various Warp meetings that some of you will recall. He's now 28. But I decided to work in hats because I could be as sculptural as I wanted without having to worry about sizes and so on. So I did that for a long time. But in fact, what happened was my studio building burned down in 1999. And I took a 5-year hiatus before I went back to doing that. And during that time, I think was my first Warp meeting up in New Hampshire. When I came back to doing my own work, as opposed to helping facilitate arts work locally, founding an art center and so on, or helping found an art center, I should say, I started making this piece, and I really didn't have any explanation to myself about why I was making that piece. But I finished it on the day that gay marriage was legalized in Massachusetts. And that became very meaningful to me, and a catalyst for really wanting to put a lot more meaning into my work, both for the viewer and for myself. And it has led to the last, this was 2004, almost 20 years of doing sculptural, mostly knitting. But now I've moved on to other media, and I'm going to give you a survey of what's happened over the years. Most of it has been political or commentary on the political climate of the day, including anti-war work from the Bush administration, many stories that go along with each of these pieces. This is basically the same front pattern for the piece that I just showed you, but I did another pattern for the back so that doing this in wire meant that they had full form. They included women in this, I think it was Wendy who said women also die in war, and I had been questioned about the last piece about why no women were included, so this one did. Another piece in wire, all of this is machine knitting. I don't recommend it. Wire is hard to work with. It breaks easily. You have to be really careful. I'm not doing so much machine knitting anymore because it's really hard on the back, surprisingly. So this was called Line of Fire. Again, this is War for Oil. Uncle Sam's Tea Party. This was a whole series that I did back in those few years when I was really reacting to our engagement in Iraq. And I took that same pattern with the bodies and made a flag. This was the first flag that I made. And it's currently actually in a show at the Fuller Craft Museum in Massachusetts. It is part of the permanent collection, and they have a show of the permanent collection that's up until next April, in case anybody's local and wants to go see that show and this piece. But when Obama was elected, I was feeling exuberant, and this piece really shows that exuberance. And there's a whole story that goes along with this about how I tried to see how many degrees of separation I was from Michelle Obama and whether she would wear it to the inaugural balls. I didn't manage to have that happen. This piece, another flag piece, it's such an iconic image that using flags has happened a lot. This was coupled with a postcard project called Lobby Congress with Art. I was encouraged to send postcards of this to all the members of Congress, which I did. And then I was giving postcards away also to people who want to sign their own names, and just encourage people to get involved. I've also done work on climate. This was in reaction to the earthquake in Haiti. A couple of more pieces about climate change and the time slipping away, which my time is probably slipping away. But one of the most resonant pieces was this, which was a flag that I knit against the backdrop of the Constitution, which I committed to unraveling during the last administration for, as you know, through and until Trump was removed from office. It actually ended up spending the last year in quarantine in my state senator's office, so that felt quite appropriate. And only came home this past April. This is a really controversial piece, and there's a story that goes along with it. It obviously speaks to a lot of different issues, but I made it because I was asked to be in a rope show, and I was searching for how to approach that, and I went and looked up phrases about rope, and this is the one that spoke to me. The last administration obviously made most of us crazy, myself included. But I am also thinking about current issues. The intersection of these two events, the 24th and the 25th of May of the New York Times front page, and Floyd's murder on the 25th. During quarantine, I also used materials that were easy to hand and started making paper mache masks. So while the former one, I actually had the front page of the New York Times printed on fabric, this is actually using the paper format. I made a number of masks because I had all of those materials here. But my current work, in the last slide I'm going to show, is moving on yet again and exploring new technologies. I have made a double-sided jigsaw puzzle. One side is the Constitution, and the other side is the names of Black victims of police violence. And I'm calling this piece Missing Pieces, and I intend to do more in this series. I'm quite taken with it, and building on what Christine was saying, I think she said, one of the pieces that I would like to do is one related to COVID. And I want to do it in a way that's really personalized. And so I have asked friends and neighbors, and I will throw it out there, but I think it's a difficult ask. If people have photographs of a loved one or somebody they know that they'd be willing to share who died from COVID, I am going to do my next piece in this format with a jigsaw puzzle with names and images from people who've died of COVID. So thank you again for being a part of this journey with me. And I turn this back to Judy.
Okay, thank you so much, Adrienne. We'll go on to Maggie now.
All right. All right, so I am going to talk a little bit about my practice and what kind of motivates me as an artist, as well in my curatorial practice as well. And it's all about thinking about community. And so I am going to circle back a little bit to some older work. I'm glad other folks have done that too. So most of you are familiar with this work. But this originated when I was kind of investigating at what point did fabric or cloth in general kind of lose its meaning as a symbolic entity in our culture that contained some kind of cultural identity or individualism or just meaning. And, that obviously led me to think about the Industrial Revolution and the impact of that and mass production and how we value something that we mass produced and then also discard on a daily basis. And so this kind of led back to my own personal history of growing up in a mill town in South Carolina. And so I was researching a bit and just kind of thinking about what that meant for me. And it started off and was launched with a conversation, just a serendipitous conversation I had with a gentleman at an old plantation that I was taking my mother to for like a fun activity. And he mentioned that he had worked for Inman Mills. And then I said, well, actually I got a scholarship from Inman Mills to go to college. And he was so excited. And he's like, oh, so what did you end up doing? And I'm like, oh, I actually am a weaver and I make textiles and I'm an artist and I teach college. And he had this like totally crestfallen look because, the identity of a textile worker in the South and this industrial part is one that's very blue collar, right? And I kind of, for a brief minute, forgot that I had that baggage and took that baggage with me when I went to art school, but fortunately I dropped it along the way, but kind of was revisiting that and just thinking again about the overlooked meaning that is non-existent in, I would say, in most industrialized mass-produced products. So this is what Buffalo Mill looked like when I was a kid living in South Carolina in 1981. It was active. And while the industry was definitely declining at the time, it still was the main employer for local residents. And then when I went to kind of do some research on that in 2016, this is what was left of the mill. And so part of that research was visiting various mill sites and then salvaging some bricks from each of the mill sites if I could find them. And then working with the community to help me with a project, with a larger project. And so I was working with the Spartanburg Art Museum, and it was like a two-part kind of project. One where I was working with spinners all around the country to help spin a whole bunch of yarn that I used as weft for this weaving yardage that I was producing in collaboration with the community. And so I led various public weaving engagements at various sites throughout Spartanburg. And they included, this was at a coffee shop, for example. The other one was actually at the museum. And so then the resulting artwork or yardage, I kind of sandwiched into the bricks that I had collected as I was, kind of doing my research of former textile mill sites. And so all of each of the fabric is actually coated in plaster. And so with each iteration or each time it's exhibited, it begins to decay and fray even more. And so that is very conscious decision to do that, so that it also mirrors somewhat of the bricks and the wornness of the bricks. And the bricks are from all sorts of different sites. So some of the mills are from the late 1700s, and some are from, even newer stuff, probably maybe the 1950s, for example. So they run the whole gamut of age there. And so while I was doing that particular series of workshops, I had multiple people kind of talk to me about who they knew and family members that they knew, or they themselves who had worked at the variety of different mills throughout the region. And so I began to think about all these under-recognized or unrecognized people who produce all of this work and labor for us. And so I, using the mill end cotton from the area, from these defunct mills, I wove the fabric. So each, there's 77 like little handkerchiefs. They're kind of like 12-inch by 12-inch pieces of fabric. And on each of them, I embroidered invisible labor. I'd started out embroidering the names of the individuals, but it just somehow didn't really resonate as much as putting this on, the invisible labor text on it. So there was a lot of trial and error where I was kind of, figuring things out. But so this is just a detailed shot of some of the 77 that are installed and finally framed. It's been one of those slow projects. And it was really great to have those kind of conversations, because it kind of led me to think about community once again. So this is actually a picture of the exhibition that I worked on, the project that Judy and I worked on at University of Louisville. And this is the International Honor Quilt. And as Judy mentioned, it was a companion piece to Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. And the whole purpose of this project was to allow people who came and visited the dinner party when it was installed throughout the world to be able to also contribute creating memorials or honor quilts, as they are called, and then these were displayed alongside, and then the whole project kind of grew as it was displayed at each location. So Judy and I had a really fun time working with this and kind of designing the layout. Previously, all of these quilts are about 540 quilts in total, produced by over 700 makers. They had been displayed on real cheap black felt, and it just, and while it was impressive as a wall, you kind of lost the individual characteristics of each of the quilts. And so I started to think about them just as they are quilts, and as the triangles kind of make up other shapes that then are reminiscent of traditional quilt patterns. I started placing them into those patterns that you would see actually. A quilt is made up of I'm not a quilter, so I'm not even going to attempt to say what the particular patterns are. But one of the things I was drawn to as I was installing these were the colors. For one thing, some of the fabrics I actually recognized because I wore clothes made by my grandmother from that very same fabric. And I started to think about, again, going back a little bit to the mass production aspect of it, and thinking about, well, this is what was on the market, and whether you were in India or Washington State or South Carolina or wherever you were, I mean, chances were, you had access to this particular fabric. And then I also was very interested in the color tones. And so what people, so for me, this was almost an example of a study of color and thinking about how those colors interact, and kind of getting a little, Joseph Albers on this whole thing. So in the layout there, and dissecting those, the quilts by those colors. And so, in this panel, you can see mostly off-whites or beige cream colors, and the star is very golden and yellow. So kind of playing around with that. So another piece that was a part of this exhibition, which was just absolutely incredible, and this is a very contentious work, because it's one that Judy Chicago herself was not willing to really even want to have in this exhibition. So I know a lot of little dirt stuff back on the background of this exhibition, but I thought it was just absolutely fabulous and wanted to include it. And it was produced, it was kind of organized by Ann Stewart Anderson, who was a local artist in Kentucky, and she had written a proposal for, long story short, she was able to partner with Judy and a few others to create this hot flash fan. And it was about thinking about menopause and how menopause isn't really discussed or covered at that time. So it was definitely a strong feminist work that obviously melded really nicely between the historical work of Judy Chicago and Woman House and all of that whole history. So so this was just a gorgeous piece. And here is Ann Stewart Anderson here on the left. She recently just passed away, unfortunately. So I'm going to kind of veer away a little bit, as Adrian did, and talk about some current work that I'm doing. So that work with the quilts got me really thinking about just pattern and that love of pattern and that color, and how those patterns are passed down to each other. And we know that through all textile production, whether it's weaving drafts or thinking about quilt patterns and how it's multi-generational. And so a lot of, so this work is a series of encaustic paintings and collages. So it's using paper and graphite and encaustic and painted on panels. They're relatively small. They're about 12 inches by 12 inches. Some are a little bit larger. But as I was kind of working through some of the color patterns, I was recalling the colors of that were used in my family's quilts that I saw, my grandmother and her sisters make, and thinking of the colors that they would have used. So kind of making each of these panels to represent one member of my family who, I thought would respond to these colors in a way. So, and just kind of playing around with that layering with these. And so then I started, this is kind of my current table setup right now that I have going on. And this is some exploration in patterns and kind of really pushing that further. And so this is a work on paper in the middle, and then on the far left is some stitched pieces, and again thinking about overlapping color patterns and what happens with that. So as I, because have been in a bit of a transitory process with my job and all this stuff, and because we recently purchased a building in Greencastle. So this is the building we purchased, and what we're going to be doing with the storefront part, which is the lower half. The upper half is going to be living quarters, which is completely vacant right now. But the bottom half, we are hoping to develop into a programmable space. So this is looking at the left, and this is like looking at the right. So the blank spot is kind of awkward there. I didn't realize it looked quite like that. But in any case, what we're hoping to do is to create a space where people can come in and just to host different events. I would say art making events, workshops that are very community driven and about community building and about utilizing a lot of textile practices and skills that I think people can come to, and they're not usually inhibited as a maker as much as like if you had a painting workshop. Some people are like, oh, I don't paint, but everyone can come to like seeing someone knit or stitch that is very familiar to them. So I'm really interested in pushing that further in this space. So that is what I've been up to, and I am finished.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. Now we have a little bit of time, and I'm gonna come up with this one question. You've all presented such wonderful political, social, cultural issues, the way you work with your art. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about how important is it to you to to get inspiration, but also feedback from people who are interacting with your work, because some of you I know have been very, very participatory. So kind of like talk about that, but also maybe through an illustration of something that's happened to you with someone who has interacted with your artwork that's been very memorable or influential. And we'll do Wendy, Adrian, and Maggie, continue in our little circle.
Hmm.
If you want to think, I can start. If you want to think about that for a
I'll
minute.
pass, yeah.
Okay, think, Wendy.
Well, I will say that this piece that I did, which was the Unraveling, I made a point of showing it over a period of 4 years. I was very lucky that the Fuller Craft Museum took it for 7 months in the beginning, and then I was just relentless about approaching other places about showing it. And there was a gallery, a local gallery in the Boston area that wanted to show it. And they went and applied for an arts grant from the Arts Council of their town. And I went in with the gallery owner to discuss it with the panel that was, the grant making body, small grant making body, but didn't, and it was turned down. And it turned out that it had been turned down because somebody on that panel saw it as desecrating the flag. And as a result, one of the women who had been part of the Arts Council, who was originally Polish, resigned. And I have her on tape at the opening where I actually did an unraveling, talking about the value of art and the importance of not censoring it. And that just added a layer of impact and importance to what I was doing. And it also, I was able to do those unravelings in public. And there were always people around me. I think the last administration just touched us all so deeply in fear and loathing, and at least me, I'll speak for myself. And it was a time where everybody who felt the same way about it kind of came together, and there was solidarity about that feeling. And to have this woman resign from the council it made a lot of impact. It made a big impact on me.
Excellent. Wendy, do you have something?
Well, I realized that one of the reasons I like three-dimensional work is that I believe textiles are made for interaction. And so I didn't show these pieces, but I've made work for people to enter this space and interact in this space and have a physical exchange with the material there. But so I don't know that I have a really overt conversation that I've had that can describe how other people felt about it, but it's important to me that people have that physical reaction as well as an intellectual reaction. And, oh, I can analyze this from my head. I want them to experience it from their body. And so it's not just me, but how somebody else might enter that space.
Excellent. Aggie?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that within my various community projects that I've led, that I really enjoy engaging with the participants, and that's, to me, is the best part of teaching and of just creating those opportunities for engagement. I mean, I do think we are in a very stressful, even though we're in a different presidency, the tension is still there. We are a very polarized society at this point. And I really do think we need to find ways in which we can build bridges and be able to disseminate factual information and to teach people how to accept factual information and convey that and have a conversation about that without being, so explosive and just, negative and stuff. And so, it's interesting because in Indiana, I mean, even though the town of Greencastle it's about 50-50, as far as which side of the fence you're on. It's the outer region is obviously very conservative, and I'm just really curious now. Because I started this position during the pandemic, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm looking forward to kind of delving deeper into that and hopefully engaging more people to be able to have those opportunities to come together and have actual productive discussions and maybe act upon that. So, I mean, there's a lot of work that I've done that I didn't show that is very, I would say, activist oriented and directing people to think and consider various things that they might not otherwise, whether it's homelessness or, immigrant refugee status or things that our government is doing. And it's something part of the sampling that I'm doing with the stitch pieces is going towards thinking about social systems. And I want to really visualize those social systems and ways in which we are further segregating ourselves from those with power and wealth, from those that are not powerful and don't have a stake in society. And so that is coming. I just haven't figured out how to kind of really present that yet.
Cool. Kelsey, do you have any questions from the chat that you think would be interesting to discuss? We still have a little bit of time here.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions in the chat, so I will read them out. The first one is a quick answer. Loretta says she did not get the name of the museum that the American flag is exhibited for Adrian.
It's the Fuller Craft Museum in Brockton, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Adrian. The next question says, wonderful presentations, thank you. Would you speak about your work processes in developing the work and making design decisions and resourcing your materials?
Who wants to tackle that?
I'll start. I actually love trying to utilize local resources, and I think the materials that I use have very specific meaning to them. It enhances the concept of the work that I'm dealing with. Anything from like the wool that I used for the brick pieces was produced from all local farmers, and then utilizing that mill end yarn from defunct mills. So that, that part is important to me. I think it's very significant. Now, I think all those materials for that particular piece, I used Procyon dyes, but I love using natural dyes. And it's one of the things I love about Wendy's work, and I got to show my students when I was at University of Louisville her work that was exhibited at a local gallery, which was fun, and share that knowledge with students as well. And I think it's sometimes that can dictate a little bit more of the direction, but it really just depends. As I would say artistically, I first think about what it is I want to say, and then how can the materials enhance what it is I'm trying to say.
Super. Anyone else on that? Your materials, or when do you basically your own?
Probably I started a natural dye garden, and almost all the dye that I use in my work now comes from the garden. Although, and the yarns are just simple cottons that I order from either a supplier. I don't have a connection to any interesting sources. Although I did, when I was in India, I went to the bazaar to get the yarn, that Lichtenstock ghetto weaving. I did all the ikat work in India, and I learned how to do the black fermentation vat in India. And then I came back and wove it on my own loom here. So that was quite a story, going into the bazaar, finding the vendor, getting the right size yarn. But here I just look for cotton yarn.
Cool.
And the project I'm working on now, I'm using some dyes I've collected at conferences that have been in my studio. They're not from my garden. So using this pandemic time to do very time-consuming e-pots and learn more about natural dyes and expanding my color palette.
Cool.
And Wendy, Loretta is asking, what did you put in your dye garden?
Oh, I started growing madder in around 2000, 2002, before
Seen the
I knew
matter.
anybody. And so I was ignorant. Madder is an invasive plant, and so it is all over my right of way, which is 20 feet wide. And that was starting with 5 plants. So anybody who's new to growing natural dyes, if you decide to grow madder, be extremely careful about it. Put it in a container or dig it regularly. So yeah, you can get Nebraska red madder directly from me. I will mail you bare roots. I have barberry, weld. Jay Rich gave me the weld many years ago, and it continues to self-seed and is doing great. I'm trying to grow indigo, but I'm not having a whole lot of luck in this heat. Marigolds, Cosmos, Janista. Well, actually, my Janista died out. It's ladies' bedstraw, gallium. So a variety of natural dye plants.
I have some of Wendy's madder that I picked up on my trip. I think I stopped to see you when I was going to the Iowa warp meeting, and she gave me madder, which went back to Colorado at the time. And then when we moved back to Washington State, that went along in a pot and is now in the garden here. So yeah, traveling madder.
Which, can I just put a plug in for that natural dye survey now?
Sure.
I was asked to write a book chapter on North American natural dye gardens, and I'm still collecting data. There is, if you go to my website, it's easy to get to, wendyweiss.org, and click on a link and fill out the survey. If you are growing natural dye plants, it just could be a modest little garden. I would love to hear from you.
And Kelsey is correct that our information is on a slide and people can get in touch with us.
Oh, good.
Right?
Your information has been shared in the chat.
Okay.
So anyone who's on the call is welcome to find their information in the chat and contact the panelists directly. We will also send your contact information out at the conclusion of the conference to everyone who registered.
Very cool. We just have like a minute left, so I think we'll wrap it up. And I just again want to thank all of these wonderful friends of mine for sharing their stories with you. And I have, if you are interested in, I do some work with memory, and I have to say, as hot as it is in Tempe, Arizona, that 7 years I spent there was pretty amazing because of the Sonoran Desert. And on my website, which you can find, clothgirl.com, I have a little story about the people who have been lost in the desert crossing from Mexico. Mm-hmm. And it's called Sonoran Souls. And it's very much about their memory and my memories of being out there, because I would take water to places in the desert for travelers, which is now would get you arrested. But at the time, that's what we did. So I would love to share that piece with you. And it's on my website under, I don't know, the culture of cloth or something like that. Just look around and you'll find it. But thank you all so much for being here. The speakers, great to see you guys. I'm glad we're all doing well. Kelsey, my friend, it's just been great. And I think the rest of the conference will be wonderful.
Thank you all for being here. It is so wonderful to see your faces. It's the next best thing to being able to meet in person.
Next year, maybe.
Thank you. It's been really fun and a great thing to do.
Thank you so much.